Hello, everyone. Probably there are still some people who are joining in because, yeah, it's now just 6 sharp, but we'll still use the time to start slowly because, as most of the people know, this session today is a shared session with the Hochschule München. So I'm also happy to welcome Christian Holler, the professor who's organizing the lecture series we collaborate with. And Christian, I'll give you the word to say a few words.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for taking us into this very interesting talk. I'm looking forward to it. So we organized the HM, what we call Hochschule München, HM Lectures for Future. And I think for many years now, we have 2 shared sessions every term. So the one is actually happening at Hochschule München and the other one is happening at the Technical University. But today, since it's online, it's an online shared. Our terms is a little bit out of the university term. So Hochschule term is a bit different. Maybe I can just show very quickly the program. And we still have 1 talk left, which would be next week. Dr. Maike Weistpflug, she will talk about possibilismus. So that's definitely going to be an interesting talk, but it's in German. So most of our lectures are actually in German. Typically, it's only the shared session which we hold in English. So thank you very much for taking us in and for the ongoing work we do together. And I hope that we're going to do the same thing next semester then. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, we're looking forward to collaborating with you also in the next semester. And that said, I would now introduce our speaker of today. I think by now most of you already know her, but we're very happy that Jutta Paulus is here with us today. She's a member of the European Parliament since 2019 as part of the Greens EFA group. And let's have a short look on how she actually got there. So from 1986 to 1990s, she studied pharmacy in Marburg and then moved to the Palatinate, which is the Pfalz in German, where she has lived ever since. And in 1991, she co-founded a laboratory specializing in indoor pollutants and ecotoxicology, later focusing on chemical testing and EU regulatory compliance. And now, following 2 decades in management, she then sold her shares in 2012 and shifted her focus to politics, while also continuing to work in quality management in laboratories and hospitals. And now, as a long-standing member of Bündnis 90, the Greens, Paulus has held numerous roles at local, state, and federal levels, particularly in energy, ecology, and environmental policy. And before going to the European Union, she also served as a chair of the Green Party in Rhineland-Palatinate. So, Ms. Paulus, we're very happy that you're here with us today to give us some insights on how, war is affecting the environmental policies on the EU level, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, it's a great honor to be lecturing, which has not been part of my curriculum vitae so far, or only in very small packages, let's put it that way. And of course, I'm very happy also to share my experiences and my insight. And I think I would like to start with differentiating between different geopolitical situations, but also different political situations, meaning how majorities have changed after the last elections to the European Parliament. When I entered Parliament in 2019, it was the very first time, I think, that that in the European Parliament we had, of course, mainly pushed by the climate movement, Fridays for Future, taking the streets, where we had a majority on the pro-democratic, pro-European side, which could be achieved without the European People's Party, which was, I think, the first time in the history of the European Parliament. Of course, there always would have been the possibility of securing a majority with the far right, which was out of the question in the last mandate, which is not the case in this mandate, but that's another story. And to be honest, I wasn't aware when I entered Parliament in 2019 that this was a sort of Goldilocks moment in history, where we had, as I said, this strong push from the public to really get active on climate, to really do climate policy, to do work on sustainability. And also we had a commission president which took that topic to her heart. And what really helped, at least in the energy and climate part, was the war that Putin waged against Ukraine. So it is not by coincidence that Politico, which is, let's say, one of the major influential news channels in Brussels, every one of us, I think, gets the Politico newsletter into their inboxes in the morning. They're usually very well informed. They have, let's say, a tabloid version, but they also have a professional version, which is really insightful. And Politico always once a year makes this who is the most influential politician ranking, blah, blah. And for the last Monday, they did a ranking which are the most influential politicians on the Green Deal, because Green Deal, of course, is more than just energy and climate. It's also about biodiversity. It's about sustainability in our supply chains. It's about sustainable finance and all that. And top of the list, number one, most influential politician, Vladimir Putin. And so I'll give you a very vivid example. When the Commission came forward with the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive, I don't know whether you know how policy making in the EU Parliament works. So it's always the Commission coming forward with a proposal. It's in the treaties. Commission has the right of initiative. This proposal goes to the Council of Member States and goes to the European Parliament. And each of the two co-legislators then makes their amendments. And at the end of the day, they have to find a compromise between their positions. When the proposal reaches European Parliament, the appropriate committee is selected. So which committee is responsible? In this case, renewable energy, the main committee responsible is the Committee for Industry, Research and Energy. And the Committee for Environmental Affairs has the right of opinion when it comes to what renewable energy can be regarded as sustainable when it comes to bioenergy. So it landed in the ITRE committee, and then the rapporteur, meaning the person that is leading the negotiations, is selected, which is a rather funny process, but never mind. And the rapporteur has, let's say, a lot of responsibility and also a lot of possibilities to shape the Parliament's position. Because at the end of the day, of course, you need a majority, but if you're a rapporteur or rapportrice, you can always tweak the compromise text a bit more in your own direction. Usually it works. So EPP got the rapporteurship on the file, and they chose Markus Pieper, and we were all like, oh my God, because Markus Pieper was very well known for being rather skeptical towards renewable energy. So we thought, oh my God, if Markus Pieper is doing it, then that wonderful proposal saying we need at least 40% renewable energy by 2030, this will never fly because Markus Pieper will try to water it down and so forth. Then we had the first debate about this proposal in the ITRE committee. And Markus Pieper took the floor and said, I now got this proposal from the European Commission, which came out before 24th of February. And I must say, 40% is too low. We have to go higher. And we were like, oh, okay. So this situation that all of a sudden the supply with fossil energy became unstable, became insecure, made Markus Pieper, who, as I said, was always very skeptical towards renewables, change his mind. So this is a case where war or geopolitical tensions, however you call it, shaped policy in, let's say, for us, a good direction. Right now, we have rather the opposite. Right now, we have the geopolitical situation around the Strait of Hormuz, and this is taken as pretext for watering down also climate legislation. I was rapporteur for the methane regulation in the last mandate. Methane regulation deals with methane emissions from energy production and transport, meaning, of course, coal, oil, gas, where you have fugitive methane emissions, which can usually quite easily be mitigated. And so the methane regulation says, dear producers, dear transporters, you have to make sure that you repair the leaks. You have to show that you measure your emissions. You have to report your emissions. You have certain very technical thresholds of measurements. How often do I have to check a pipeline from this or that material and all that? And the good thing is it's also valid for imports. So, of course, not at once, starting slowly in 2027, importers have to show the oil, gas, coal, which we import. These rules on monitoring, reporting, and verification of the emissions are being followed. And of course, the oil and gas industry, especially in the US, doesn't like those rules, obviously. So they have been lobbying against the methane regulation from the very first. And now we're at a stage where the pressure doesn't come only from companies, but also from the US ambassador to the European Union, who has written several opinion pieces for different news channels saying, if Europe does not abolish this methane regulation, they are going to experience a very cold winter. So it's open threats against legislation which was democratically agreed. And what we're now seeing is that the European Commission is not taking back the legislation, but they are giving guidance to member states saying, well, maybe you should not apply the penalties for the next 3 years, which is basically a stop the clock on the regulation, obviously, because if you don't have to face penalties, why should you follow the legislation in the first place? So we are seeing a rather, let's say, cautious approach when it comes to holding up the legislation, which was agreed among the co-legislators. What has, of course, also changed is that we have different majorities now in the European Parliament, where the progressive parties, meaning Social Democrats, Liberals, Greens, left not so much, but Social Democrats, Liberals, Greens have all lost seats. European People's Party, being medium conservative, has gained some seats, not too many, but the real gains were at the side of the so-called patriots, which is Lega Nord, Rassemblement National, Orban's party, Fidesz, these kind of people, and also the European Conservatives and Reformers, which is Fratelli d'Italia, Meloni's party, PiS party from Poland, so the Eurosceptic conservative parties. And while in the last mandate, EPP always made compromises with the so-called platform, meaning liberals and social democrats, often together with us Greens, they are now saying, well, there's so much stuff that was negotiated in the last mandate that is now making things difficult for our companies, for our economy. We have to repair this. And if the pro-European democratic forces are not agreeing to what we want, we will go with the far right, which is, for example, what they did when it came to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, or also the directive on supply chains. And that has really substantially changed. And right now, what we are also seeing is that the first voices within the conservative spectrum are saying, well, maybe it was wrong to be so tough on Russia, because now we have the problem that we don't have the security of supply anymore, and we should even water down our own rules when it comes, for example, to water protection. So the Commission has now published that they want to open the Water Framework Directive in order to make it easier for the mining industry to mine minerals, but also fossil fuels in the European Union, because if you don't have to adhere to the rules on clean water, you will save a lot of cost. But of course, the cost will still be there. It will just be borne by someone else, meaning, of course, the public, which is what we always wanted to avoid, because we have the polluter pays principle in the treaties, and we should really make sure that we don't trade short-term gains against long-term detriments to our environment, which we all rely on. I mean, try building an economy without clean water. I don't think that you will get very far. So I'm a bit anxious about the month and also the next year to come. Today, the World Meteorological Organization has formally announced El Niño is here. So we will see a massive El Niño, probably, meaning that I don't know whether you're familiar with the expression. It means that the surface water in the Pacific Ocean is exceptionally hot, and this has repercussions on droughts, on heat waves, on failing crops, especially in the global south. And I don't think that this will, let's say, be good for geopolitical tensions. On the opposite. And also Southeast Asia is much more hit than we are by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because they have virtually no domestic production of oil, gas, coal. They are already rationing, and so I'm not sure whether the geopolitical situation will not even turn worse in the months to come. Yeah, and of course, this narrative of we have these short-term problems. We cannot look at the long-term problems because all our energy is used up by the short-term problems. I think it's really dangerous, because by not looking at the long-term problems, they will not go away. On the contrary, we will actually have even larger long-term problems, which then become short-term very quickly. So I'm quite often in contact with the colleagues from my political group who do foreign policy, and we try also to find like co-benefits. For example, there is this really good idea of re-wetting peatlands, which would be good for biodiversity, which would be good for water resilience, which would be good for the climate. And the idea is to re-wet especially the peatlands which are located at the eastern border of the European Union, because a peatland is, of course, not no obstacle for a drone, but it is a very relevant obstacle for, let's say, a tank or also artillery. You cannot go through a place where even a human must be careful not to sink in. So that would be a very effective way of making it more difficult for any aggressor to invade our country, and it would be something that could not be counted as aggression, because obviously you cannot attack someone with a re-wetted peatland. So we are looking also for these kind of co-benefits. I'm also advocating for a more rapid enforcement and more guidance from the European Commission when it comes to energy efficiency measures, because every kilowatt hour which we do not need, we don't need to import, we don't need to make sure that we can pay for it, we don't have to make deals with autocrats. So that is also something which I find very important to look at. We have more sovereignty in the European Union, especially when it comes to energy. We have the very good examples right within our own member states. For example, Spain has made a rapid build out of renewable energy in the last 5 years, and they have now today the cheapest electricity prices in the European Union and the most stable electricity prices in the European Union, because they are no longer so dependent on gas setting the price. And I think we have to learn from these examples. We have to learn from the Scandinavian countries when it comes to heat pumps. We have to learn from the Baltic countries when it comes to smart meters, where you can much better empower people to be part of the transition and also to balance out the grid, because you encourage people to use electricity when the price is low. Everyone can do it. Everyone can, for example, turn their fridge a bit lower, so to store the energy in the form of cold temperatures, or use your dishwasher, whatever. So if you give people the opportunity to participate, you usually have a very big effect without having to subsidize it, because a lot of people are actually willing to participate. And I think it's very important to give them the opportunity. We had, when Putin invaded Ukraine, we had these wonderful stickers saying, isolate Putin, insulate homes. And I think that is the way we have to go. Open for your questions.
Thanks for their insights. Yeah, you can, like all the participants, you can either turn on your microphone. You have the allowance to do that. If you turn on the microphone to ask a question, also it would be nice if you turn on your video so we can see it. If you rather prefer to be anonymous, you can also post a question in the chat.
Or the Q&A.
Or the Q&A version of it. And yes. In the meantime, until like the questions are popping up, I wanted to ask you if you could describe, like you mentioned, you feel a bit anxious about the upcoming time and years. I wanted to ask if that's like a personal opinion of your personal feeling. Do you also feel like most of the other politicians in the European Union feel that way at the moment?
I think it really depends on whom you ask. And I remember when in the last mandate, I was part of the delegation to Japan. So obviously we went to Japan. That's what you're doing when you're in this delegation. So it's always 1 year the Japanese delegation visits the European Union and vice versa. And I was astonished that a lot of the Japanese members of parliament were very, very optimistic about everything. And I was like, okay, planetary boundaries, ever heard of that concept? And it wasn't they weren't so familiar with it. So that is something where I believe it is a matter of knowledge or attention, and also a matter of what is your relationship, I might say, to science. Because, for example, I had an exchange with the head of cabinet of Commissioner Dombrovskis. Commissioner Dombrovskis is the one who is to whom the so-called competitiveness and simplification agenda was assigned. So it's his duty to simplify legislation, which usually means deregulation. And his head of cabinet is, so to speak, at the helm of things and steering all that. And I was talking to him and he was like, yeah, in the last mandate, you did far too much in far too little time. And our economy needs a room to breathe and to adapt. And I was trying to figure out whether he was grasping why this legislation was passed in the first place, because of course we didn't pass this legislation in order to make life difficult for industry and the economy. There was rather a, let's say, long-term vision behind it, saying, okay, if we want to keep a good keep the possibility for a good life of our citizens, we need to become more sustainable. We need to turn away from destructive technologies, from agriculture, which is taking more than it gives back, and all that. And then during this conversation with Mr. Haga, I realized that for him, scientists are just another lobby. And that he doesn't differentiate between someone coming to him representing a company which, of course, wants to make profit. I mean, that's how our system works. And someone who comes from a university and says, hey, I have examined this and that and that and that, and we really, really have to pay attention to this and that because our soils become less fertile, we have less pollinators, all that. So to him, it was they're all lobbyists. And some of them are helping our economy and some of them are not. So a totally different view towards science than I have it. I mean, having studied natural science myself and talking a lot to scientists and also trying at least to read studies and not only the abstract, which is a bit time consuming, but never mind. But I think this is a rather rare attitude when you look inside at least the European Parliament, not so much within the Commission, but there with Mr. Hager, who is unfortunately in charge of making things easier for industry. There we have exactly this attitude. So the colleagues which I work with on, let's say, my topics like energy efficiency, like halting biodiversity loss, like fighting PFAS, they, of course, are as worried as I am. The ones that are not working on environmental matters, but on external policy, they are, of course, worried when it comes to the role of Russia, also the disinformation that Russia is spreading within our democracies, trying to destroy our democracies from within. Others are worried about the rise of the tech brothers in the United States, of the possibility that the United States could blackmail us, basically, because we still depend so much on products that we simply don't have in Europe. I mean, the whole IT architecture of the European Parliament is running on Microsoft systems. So if Microsoft were to say, well, you have been mean to us, we simply turn off your license, then it would be a difficult situation, let's put it that way. So there are a lot of worries about this kind of thing, but the worries about the environmental situation, at least in the Parliament and also in the Council, have a bit moved into the background. And therefore, I found it very interesting that the Eurobarometer survey found out that a lot of people, of citizens, are still worried about nature and biodiversity loss, are still worried about climate, are still worried about heat waves, about extreme weather events, because that is also something that people see, that people can feel. And therefore, I think we have a duty as politicians not to look at the short term only and at the next 4 years only, but to have in mind, where do we want to go? The other day I had a coffee with a former colleague who had been an MEP in the last mandate, who did not get re-elected, unfortunately, who was a member of the EPP, and we had been negotiating on several files together. And let's put it that way, of course, we had different political views, else we wouldn't have been in different political groups, obviously. But she is a person who would not, well, she was standing by her word. So if you struck a compromise with Maria, you could be sure she will not tell her own group to vote against that compromise, but she will defend it also in her own group. And she said she's very worried about the path that EPP is taking, because by increasingly working with the far right, the far right want to abolish the European Union. Right. And she says, my party should have a vision. Where shall the union be in 2035, in 2040, in 2050? And that isn't something that she is missing very much. And of course, a time of crisis means you have to react as quickly as possible and to very, very short-term needs. But still, I think you should never forget that there is a day after tomorrow, and that there is a year after next year, and that there is a decade after the next decade. And you should always ask yourself, what does that mean for the long-term vision? What does that mean for the way we actually have to take in order to preserve the livelihood of our citizens?
So now I'm unmuted. Thank you. There is also a question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out loud so everyone can hear it. So Johanna Heichele was asking, how significant are the differences between EU countries when it comes to their willingness and capability to pursue sustainability? And is there a major divide in optimism or pessimism across EU member states regarding whether these green goals can actually be reached?
I would say, as my general perception, which I mean, other people might have other perceptions because I have been talking to different people. So, but my general perception is that the green goals are looked at more skeptically in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think this has two reasons. First of all is that the economic situation is usually worse than in the Northwest. Let's put it that way. And second, which I realized quite late, to be honest. Second, for example, when you look at Czech Republic or German Democratic Republic during the time of the so-called socialism, in my view that wasn't socialism, but never mind, they had a lot of environmental pollution because the regime didn't really care for the environment and for also shielding their people from unhealthy emissions. And then after the wall fell, thankfully, and after things changed, let's put it that way, and especially after they joined also the European Union, where of course a lot of money was flowing to these countries, a lot could be remedied. I mean, there were wastewater treatment plants being built, there was restoration of devastated areas, there was also support for more modern technology, and so they could see before their very eyes that things can become better again. And so there's maybe this belief, okay, even if we pollute now, we can clean it up afterwards. But the problem is, of course, that when it comes to biodiversity loss, it's quite permanent, right? So if a species goes extinct, it's extinct. It's about the most permanent thing you can do on this planet, going extinct, because of course the species will never come back. And also when it comes to climate, once tipping points are reached and passed, you will not be able to go back to normal again. And the news that I've been reading the other week about the new study on the Atlantic Mediterranean overturning circulation, better known as Gulf Stream, or Gulf Stream is part of that system, becoming weaker and weaker, and that there is now a very substantial chance of this circulation coming to a stop before 2100. And then we will be talking about a whole set of different problems as compared to now. And the tipping point might be reached in quite a short time. So that's something where you cannot say we will look at that next year or in 5 years or in 10 years. But yeah, I think this is something that's not very clear to everyone, because of course I do read a lot about environmental issues because that's my field of work. But someone who works on, let's say, foreign affairs or democracy and justice or gender equality or research might not have this focus. Yeah, so that's one of the problems. And as I said, for Central and Eastern European countries, what comes on top is that for very good reasons, they are skeptical with a centralized body telling you what to do, basically, right? So they say, we have fought for our freedom, which is, of course, very, very true for Poland, for Czech Republic, for Slovakia, for Hungary. They really have fought for their freedom, have gained their freedom. They have worked a whole lot in order to get where they are today. And now there is someone telling them, oh, but your cars, your internal combustion and cars, that's not good. And they're very skeptical, because to them it's a bit like, okay, we have experienced that before. We have experienced a centralized body telling us what was good and what was not good. And we would like to choose ourselves. So that is a very common thinking, especially in the more conservative part of the politicians of these countries.
Thank you. Very interesting. If somebody has a follow-up question from the audience, please feel free to also unmute yourself or raise your hand and then unmute yourself. Otherwise, we can continue with the next question that was posted in the chat, which is regarding to the peatland restoration that you just mentioned. So this person was writing, you mentioned restoration of peatlands as a benefit for both environment and passive defense. Is there other potential, like a number of other concrete examples that go the same way? Or is the synergy between environmental protection and military use basically limited to this like one peatland example?
I mean, when it comes to peatlands, it's of course the most obvious, but also if you would have a protected forest area where you have basically a region dedicated fully to nature, where you don't have pathways or even streets running through it, where you don't have those very orderly plantations of spruces or pine or whatever, but rather a big hubbub of all sorts of trees, fallen ones, where you have ditches and all kind of wilderness. That is much more difficult to pass. But of course, it takes much more time for a forest to develop into a wilderness. Whereas a peatland, which is drained and used for agricultural reasons, it's sufficient to simply close the ditches so that the water doesn't run out anymore, and then wait for a year or maybe 1.5, and it's impossible.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to motivate the students again to raise their questions. Don't be shy. I think it's a unique opportunity to ask questions about insights of the European Union. So yeah, don't hold back. In the meantime, I have another question. I was wondering, you mentioned that some of your politician colleagues, they, for example, see scientists as lobbyists, which kind of seems tough to hear that when studying at the university. I was wondering, like, how do you hold up with it? How do you like keep on like fighting for the environment and sustainability politics while having so much like contra movements beside you? And yeah, I think also as students, sometimes it's hard to keep on like engaging for climate and environment if you hear so much, or yeah, if you get so much counter breezes. So maybe you can give us some valuable tips.
Yes, I mean, when you look at let's take an easy example, which is renewable energy. When renewable energy started like 30 years ago to come out of the niche of very, very specialized use in remote areas, in space, in research stations, which are very, very remote, but needed some sort of electricity. That were the first uses of renewable energy. So when I first was really, I mean, I know that James Hansen had this famous lecture in US Congress about climate change, 1988. I heard of it in 1989. And only then I learned that already Svante Arrhenius had calculated it all, actually. I was quite, how should I say, I was very pessimistic because renewable energy wasn't something that we could imagine back then playing a major role in providing us with energy. I mean, the big four German electricity companies made a big advertisement saying, even if we exploit every potential we have in Germany, renewable energy could only give us 4% of our electricity we need, right? So that was the narrative back then. And as green, of course, I wasn't a big fan of nuclear energy either. And so I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do with the climate crisis if we have really no alternative to burning fossil fuels? And then this renewable energy started to very slowly take up a bit of, not speed really, but the first nerds started to build their own solar panels, put them on their roofs and so forth. And then we had the big starting point with Germany's renewable energy law in the year 2000. But even back then, we couldn't have imagined that in 2025, we would have 60% renewable energy in Germany, right? And the other day, I saw a photo on social media, an area view of Aleppo in Syria. And of course, you see a lot of buildings that are damaged or even destroyed. But the buildings which are inhabited, on each and every one, you see solar panels, right? Which is, of course, also because the electricity grid is so destroyed and electricity supply is so unstable that people say, okay, I'll have some solar panels and I'll put my old car battery as a battery so that I can turn on the light in the evening. And that would have been unthinkable only a few years back. So we have a huge success story when it comes to replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. Renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels in most regions of the world today. And now we're in the phase of the Empire Strikes Back. I mean, the fossil fuel companies, if you look at the last 50 years of fossil fuel use and sales and all that, they have made $3 billion of profit per day. Not turnover, profit per day for each of the last 50 years. Of course, they fight tooth and nail in order to keep their business model running. And it's becoming harder every day as we speak. So I don't know how many fairy tales or fantasy novels you have read, but none of it ends with, and then the hero gave up. Of course, we must not give up. Of course, we have to keep on fighting. I mean, we're the ones we've been waiting for, right? And what would be the alternative? The alternative would be to sit back and say, well, the others are so strong, there's nothing I could do. I mean, for me, the alternative would be like jumping from a balcony, committing suicide. That doesn't sound too attractive. So my personal view is every fraction of a degree global heating which can be avoided, every species which doesn't go extinct is a win, is a victory. And at least I have tried. Even if I don't succeed, I have tried. And of course, there are phases when I'm depressed, when I come back from negotiations where virtually none of my very good ideas got accepted. And then I think you also need structures that give you strength, that give you power, that reassure you. So sitting together with friends, going for a walk, taking your bike someplace, you need some sort of repowering for yourself, basically. But yeah, as I said, even if we don't succeed, I don't want to ask myself at the end of the day, could I have done more? Should I have done more? And there's also a power in trying, because you know I am fighting, and even if I don't succeed, at least I can tell myself, you have fought, you have given your best.
Thanks for those very honest words and also like captivating words. It's also nice that you chose like politics as your kind of battlefield, if I'm allowed to frame it that way. Yeah, I think we can continue with more questions. I also want to ask the people sitting in the room with me, if you have any questions, don't hold back, or if you have, give me a wink. Okay, otherwise I'll continue with the one that is in the chat. So there's another question from Johanna. So she's asking, since the emission trading system for carbon already exists, what are your thoughts on a similar system for biodiversity? Alternatively, what other ideas do you have for addressing biodiversity in the same intensity than carbon?
Of course, it's much more difficult to develop something similar for biodiversity, because when we're talking about emission trading, you can very easily count the CO2 that is emitted by simply doing the necessary mathematical calculations. So the company has to show, okay, we bought so and so many BCM gas or so and so many tons of coal, and then you can easily convert it into CO2. And when it comes to biodiversity, how do you trade a forest against a peatland, or how do you trade a more sustainable way to do agriculture against taking away a barrier in a crook? So what actually the Commission is doing right now, they are developing a methodology for so-called nature credits. Nature credits is something that Ursula von der Leyen came up with. I think because she is very well aware that we simply don't have the necessary public funds available for the challenge of nature restoration. You know that there is a nature restoration regulation at the European level, which was very contentious. It was a very hard battle to get it adopted at all. And right now, the member states have to come up with their national restoration plans, where they have to show which restoration measures or which instruments do they want to deploy, and what do they expect to be the result when it comes to reaching the goals of the European Nature Restoration Regulation. And in Germany, we have the rather comfortable situation that we have the action plan on natural climate protection and adaptation with nearly 4 billion euro. Other member states do not have that. And even the 4 billion euro will by far not be enough to fund all the necessary restoration measures. So Ursula von der Leyen had the brilliant idea to say, okay, we need something like nature credits, similar to the carbon credit system, which was deployed under the Rio Convention. But we need a very strong framework. So right now there is a circle of experts on biodiversity who try to develop this kind of framework so that we don't have the same problem as with the carbon credits, where afterwards it became clear that a lot of these carbon credits were literally thin air only and did not have any additional effect. And there I'm very hopeful that we might have a system which can work. The only question is, in how far will actually private money be attracted to these credits? Because if they are voluntary, I'm not sure how many companies will actually use them. My hope lies a bit with the financial system and the insurance companies. For example, I had a conversation with someone who is working at a very, very big food company, and he said they wanted to expand and needed a lot of money and went to their bank, and the bank said, well, show me your business case, show me your risk assessment, blah, blah, blah. And in the risk assessment, there was also this position, loss of fertile soil. And then the bank said, okay, and what is your action? How are you mitigating that risk? And they had to say, we don't know, basically. And so the bank said, that's not enough. You have to show action, that you're actually doing something to mitigate that risk. And so he was actually looking for a project where they could have a cooperation with farmers who farm the land in a way that you have more humus, more fertile soil, by the way the land is worked on. Because that would for them be important to show to their bank. But it's also a way of a nature credit, basically. Or you could do something similar when it comes to, for example, pollinators, which are also very important for our food system. 70% of our crops depend on pollination, not the staple crops, so not wheat and rye and corn and all that, but nearly all vegetables and fruit need to be pollinated. And pollinator populations are in steep decline. It would be a very good idea to pay farmers to work in a way that pollinator populations can stabilize.
Awesome. Thank you. I see there are more questions coming in, which is great. Keep it up. I'll just read out the next one. So Chiara is asking, sometimes while arguing, especially with people who are more on the right political side, I encounter the argument that science will find a way to fight against climate change. Those people think they don't need to change anything in their way of living because science will do it and find a way no matter what. What is your opinion on that argument, and can we rely solely on science?
Well, actually, science has found a way, right? I mean, that's what the IPCC has been doing for the last, I don't know how many years, how many decades. It's very, very clearly mapped out what science tells us about which way we should choose. But let's put it that way, our chances of keeping the world's climate on a pathway which makes it possible to keep up human civilization are dwindling with every day we are not acting. And that is also laid down very clear in the very scientific reports from the IPCC. And to wait for a miracle which falls from the sky and can be deployed instantly all over the world is quite a risky strategy. I mean, it's a bit like, okay, we have this plane you're going to enter, and right now we have a chance of like 30% of the plane not crashing. But maybe during your flight, some wonder will occur so that the plane will in any case land safely. Would that person enter the plane? I think not. And I think those probabilities are not very clear to many people. And part of the problem is, of course, I mean, if I remember the second last federal election in 2021, when Olaf Scholz had those placations with Klimakanzler, and he was always talking about we have to decarbonize our industry. That was all. Nothing on we have to change the way we move from A to B. We have to insulate our homes. We have to change our food systems. He didn't talk about all that. So he sort of reinforced the belief of people, well, the politicians and the scientists have to have some good ideas about industry, but I myself don't have to change anything and don't have to do anything. And unfortunately, I mean, I still have to order this book. Harald Lesch has brought out a new book, which is called Die Natur hat kein Parteibuch. Nature doesn't have a party, doesn't belong to a party. And it's a bit like physics don't negotiate. But as we politicians maybe are so used to negotiating, people think, well, we can negotiate about everything. Well, try negotiating with gravitation. You won't get any far.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Harald Lesch is not joining today's lecture. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know if Christian Hollers is also still there because they're like good colleagues.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue with the next question. So Sarah is asking, do you think that in 5 or 10 years we'll move away from the current shift to the political right?
That's an interesting question. I mean, right now the debate which we're having in Germany is a bit, let's say, blindfold to historical experience. I often hear from people, well, why not let AfD govern a bit? Then people will find out that they don't have the solution either. And I'm always like, okay, this is a strategy that has been tried in Austria, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Finland, and nowhere it has led to the far right becoming smaller. Even though they were not able to govern well, it didn't matter. On the contrary, they got stronger because the impression of the, let's say, undecided voters was, well, okay, they seem to be a party like every other because they are allowed to govern. So empirical evidence shows that this strategy does not lead to the far right becoming smaller again. And I simply don't know why this should be tried once more in Germany in order to maybe get a different result, which I don't see any reason for. But on the other hand, what I do think is that, I mean, it will become ever more evident that our demographic problem increases. I mean, I belong to this baby boomer generation. We were always too many. We were too many at school, so we were. When I started in school, we were taught in containers, which were put on the yard of the school because there were simply no rooms for so many children. Then when I graduated from school, a lot of us didn't get a place for an education. At the university, we were all sitting on the stairs because there were not enough chairs for us. Then having finished university, there were not enough jobs for us. So we're very used to this situation of being too many. And of course, now finishing or close to finishing or being close to pension age, of course, as pensioners, we will always also be too many. Why shouldn't it be different? And that means that the problem of not having sufficient skilled workforce, which is already now apparent in many member states, will even become stronger in the years to come. And there, the far right doesn't have an answer. They simply don't have an answer because they don't want more women working, because women are supposed to be mothers and caretakers, whatever. And they don't want to have any migrants. So what is your answer to that? And as far as I know, they haven't given one yet. But we have very good counterexamples when, for example, you look at Spain again. Spain has not only cheap energy, Spain also doesn't have the problem of not having enough workforce because they liberalized migration. They had a lot of migrants without papers within their borders, and they said, okay, we'll now do an amnesty. Everyone who is here without papers but can show that he or she is working, you'll get an official title, you may stay, full stop. And that, of course, led to a lot of illegal, I hate that word, let's call it irregular or unregistered. That led to a lot of unregistered migrants daring to come out in the open and saying, yeah, I'm here and I have a job and I would really like to stay. And so that also opened the door for them having, for example, acquiring better skills, starting an education, which before they could not do. And when we look at the situation in Germany, when you look at the founders, who is founding companies, who is taking this step and taking risks, it's over proportionally, it's migrant people, because they say, we want a better life for our children. We are ready to take the risks because there is discrimination on the job market. Don't tell me otherwise. And so for them, the incentive to become active themselves is much, much higher. Before being a full-time politician, I was working in a hospital in process and quality management. If you would take out all the migrants from this hospital, it might as well close its doors, because we wouldn't have had enough nurses, we wouldn't have had enough doctors, so it was unthinkable. And the funny thing is, it is a hospital which is run by a Christian organization. So basically, it was founded by nuns, which is not the case today, of course, but still the owner is a Christian organization. And when I came there, I was like, okay, a bit difficult because I'm not a church member. And so when they employed me, they said, well, we saw that you don't belong to any church. And I'm like, no. Okay, we will take you out now, but maybe you should think about joining a church. I'm like, okay, a church? Yes, any monotheistic religion is fine. So it wasn't anymore Catholic. It wasn't even Catholic or Protestant. It was only monotheism, because else they wouldn't have been able to attract the workforce. And as I said, that's a problem where I haven't heard any answer from the far right yet.
Awesome. Thank you. I would just hand over to the person sitting next to me to ask the next question.
Hi, I wanted to ask, what do you think of agreements like the Mercosur agreement with the EU, and what do you think of the strategy, like, for example, of Canada's vision of the Union of Middle Power States? Where do you see the EU there, and what can we do there?
The Mercosur issue was, for my political group, quite difficult, because, I mean, for I think 20 years, I mean, it has been negotiating for a long time. Our election manifestos always said we're very critical towards Mercosur. But now, at least we as German Greens, it's not the same with our French and Italian colleagues, for example, are saying, well, in this difficult geopolitical environment, we should not let those democratic forces down which wanted the Mercosur agreement in Latin America. And we shouldn't be too nitty-gritty on our values or priorities, because why should we be the ones who are right and the Brazilian people not, for example? So I think we do need much more joint forces outside of the classical US, China, maybe India. I mean, India is very much on the rise. India has evolved a lot in the last 20 years. that we should make sure that we have our allies around the world and that we keep those forces that are at least not an autocracy together a bit. So I think it's very important that we finally succeeded in having the Mercosur agreement. And I know there was a lot of debate about us Greens having voted against, which was not true, but we voted in favor of the European Court of Justice having a look at the text, because some parts of the text were more or less not properly assessed before the agreement was finalized. They came up very, very last notice. And so we wanted to make sure that it's really legally sound. So I voted for the European Court of Justice doing an opinion, but I also said I want the agreement to be applied already during this scrutiny of the European Court of Justice. Unfortunately, the media said you wanted to kill Mercosur, which is not true, obviously, and we did not, as group, which was really stupid, think about who will also vote in favor of our resolution, because else it would have been clear, okay, you will get a majority only together with the far right, and then maybe we would have decided differently. But that's spilled milk. But in general, yes, I think we need strong agreements among democratic countries.
And would you say you now experience like a shift in mindset in the European Union, in the Parliament, on the focus, like, okay, we should go away or shift away from the dependency on the US and look around, okay, who else could be our allies and partners?
There again, it depends a bit on whom you ask. For example, the ECR, being, as I said, Meloni, PiS-Partei, and so forth, they are still very pro-US, so they don't see any problems there. Whereas I think the farther left you go, the bigger the skepsis gets. Okay. Especially also if you look what happened to the head of the International Criminal Court, where the ICC brought forward a resolution against Benjamin Netanyahu, and then upon pressure from the US government, the head of the ICC doesn't get a credit card anymore, doesn't get a mail account by any of the tech brothers anymore. So that's really a real danger. And I think that within the Commission, this has become quite clear. So that it has a reason that they came forward last week with the Tech Sovereignty Act. But of course, you cannot change these things overnight. And I wish there would be a bit more thinking like in France or in Schleswig-Holstein, where governments are switching to open source solutions in order to be not so dependent on especially the IT systems, software, and so forth coming from the US.
Thank you.
I think there is a question that fits kind of well to that. So Lucius is asking, do you think there's a risk that Europe could lose competitiveness compared to the United States and China if environmental regulations become too ambitious?
Well, it might also be the other way around, because you cannot build an economy without water, without clean water, for example. I had a conversation with a professor for sustainability some months back, and he said, well, do you know that I traveled to China 2 months ago? And I said, hey, why did you travel to China? Well, the Chinese government invited me. They wanted they wanted to consult me on how can they best ensure that they can halt biodiversity loss in order to preserve their natural resources, which they need to provide clean water to feed their population and so forth. So it's not that China is not doing anything at all. And also when we look at the US, I mean, the most contentious thing in the US right now, apart from the high prices, is actually the massive expansion of data centers, which are often powered by specially built gas turbines and which use up immense amounts of water. And people say, well, how much water will be left for us? And how much will my electricity bill go up because that data center has such a high demand? So I think in the short term, of course, you might have some gains by ignoring the environment, but in the long term, it's the infrastructure we all depend on which economy also depend on. And I think what the current German government is doing by, for example, scrapping the respective part in the Ministry of Energy and Economy, where they just build up sort of a assessment on going beyond the BIP, going beyond only the balance sheet, looking only at financial things, but also looking at what social impact does happen, how is the impact on, for example, clean water, how is the impact on biodiversity, because all this is also the foundation of our existence and therefore also of our economy. And the current government actively decides to be blind on this eye. And I'm so astonished, because I think, why go back? Why abolish progress that has been made? Even if you say, okay, that doesn't play a role for, I don't know, taxation or assessment or whatever, or rating. But why even scrap the information? That is something I really don't understand. And I really recommend reading Unsere Welt neu denken by Maya Göpel, where she's an economist, right? Where she really lays down very clearly that not counting in the loss of natural capital is actually deceiving yourself. So you will be competitive, yes, but it will be a short-term competitiveness.
Now, I think you can hear me again. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I think there's another question, so I would just continue. Another student is asking, could climate change itself become one of the biggest drivers of future conflicts and migration? So it's actually probably back to when you mentioned migration. So for example, water shortages would lead to water wars. How does or how should the EU prepare for that?
Yeah, actually, I do think that is a huge risk. Not so much, and I mean, that sounds a bit cynical. I had a very intense conversation with Erik Marquardt about this. Erik Marquardt is our spokesperson for migration and migration policy and fugitives. And he says, well, if you look at how those movements happen, it is not the poorest people which are packing their stuff and trying to move. They usually just starve to death. It's the ones which are middle class, which have a bit of savings, which can even afford to go look for a life elsewhere. But I think there will be, if we don't manage to mitigate climate change quickly enough, there will be millions that simply have to move. I mean, with sea level rise, you cannot say, well, stay where you are. It simply will not be possible. And I'm not really optimistic, if this happens, that we will be able to keep up some sort of humanity. I mean, look at what's happening already now with what member states have negotiated together with European Parliament, where again the EPP and the far right formed a majority. It's basically you can send people back to countries they never came from. You can put people basically into jail until you find a plane that brings them somewhere. Also families with children into jail. And I think this is not our European values, not at all. And if already now, where the pressure for migration is really not that big, are talking in these terms and doing this sort of action, what on earth will happen if there will really be millions on the way? I cannot imagine.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have another kind of topic break again, because this one is regarding the energy as well, but I just read it out loud. So what is the EU strategy for providing an infrastructure-based energy storage system? Because this would allow for a real 100% renewable energy grid, since there are no outage problems. As far as I am aware of, the public discussion is mostly about the production of green energy, not on how we store it, and ensure heavy industries that they have a stable grid. Thank you.
Actually, we do talk a lot also about storage. Right now, I'm part of the negotiations on the so-called CEF, Connecting Europe facility, which is a ring-fenced pot within the EU budget, which is reserved for connecting Europe, as it's in the name. And the money will be spent according to two guidelines. One is called Trans-European Network on Transport, and the other Trans-European Network on Energy. In these guidelines, we have, so to speak, the framework on how this money should be spent. For example, in 10T, there is an annex with the main magistrals, it's called, so the main streets or waterways or railways, which should be strengthened to connect Europe. So it's always about cross-border, or at least cross-border use. And the same is true, of course, for energy, where we have the framework and the 10E, Trans-European Network for Energy, which says the money should be spent for cross-border projects of common European interest, which will enable us to have a more stable, more competitive energy grid. We managed in the last mandate to keep fossil fuels out of it, which is, I think, a very good idea. But to have electricity infrastructure, be it a cable, be it a storage, be it renewable energy project that stretches across the border explicitly in. So we already have this. We already have in the electricity market design actually provisions on that member states should, in their own national markets or within the bidding zones, encourage the build out of storage. The truth is, of course, storage alone, meaning battery storage, will not be sufficient to bring us through 2 dark weeks without wind, which is happening every few years. Of course, those Dunkelflaute, it's a word which has even made it into English, like kindergarten. Dunkelflaute is something that becomes less likely the better connected we are, because somewhere in Europe you always will have some sort of wind or even solar. But what we're seeing right now in Germany is that the national government is rather taking the opposite direction. That really is a pity, because battery storage has become so incredibly cheap that we really should use it. In other countries, there is much more, I don't know, power of innovation, right? So for example, in Finland, they have built a huge heat storage in order to, so they're saving it's basically very, very well insulated body, which is heated up and which is then powering the district heating for the whole winter, which is, I think, a brilliant idea. Why not? Because it's much easier to store heat than to store electricity. So it's not that no one talks about it. It's more that we don't see that much action in Germany. There is much more action in other European countries.